केले लाव. Welcome to Ambedkar Karwa. First of all, we remember Ramai on her anniversary today, and we pay homage and salutation to her. Today we are going to have an esteemed scholar with us, Dr. Prabodhan Pol. He is a faculty at Manipal Center, and he completed his doctorate from Historical History Center of History from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and he is also postdoc fellow with from Germany, which is being funded by Max Muller Center, London. Prabodhan is a regular contributor to national dailies and Marathi newspaper on the subjects which he is particularly related to. So, welcome to Ambedkar Karwa, Prabodhan and Jai Bhim.
Thank you. Jai Bhim.
So, as you all know, Babasaheb started 4 newspapers from 1920 to 1956, and though he contributed majorly in English, he also wrote extensively in Marathi, from Muk Nayak to Bahishkrit Bharat, Janta, and then Prabuddha Bharat. So his contribution to Marathi is also been published by Government of Maharashtra. Most of his articles, which are as editorial, or some articles in volume 19 and 20. So from this Marathi dailies, what were his contributions and all, which is not majorly translated into English. And from this point of view, today's topic is very much relevant for non-Marathi speakers. So I request Prabodhan to present his views on Babasaheb Ambedkar and his newspapers, historical perspective. Over to you, Prabodhan.
Yeah, thank you, Priyadarshi. Firstly, I must congratulate Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Karavan for organizing such a wonderful series of online presentations. These presentations are serious, insightful, and instructive for scholars, activists, and curious minds across the generations, continents, and social political beliefs. Secondly, I'm also thankful to Ambedkar Karavan for inviting me to present my thoughts. I'm grateful for being included in the coveted list. I'm also thankful to Priyadarshi and Mangesh Daiwale for conducting this session. My topic, the topic that I have chosen to speak on is on newspapers. I'm going to present on historical newspapers conducted by Babasaheb Ambedkar from 1920 to 1956. This aspect of Ambedkar's contribution has been generally neglected for a long time. His newspapers had played a very crucial role in social and political discourse of anti-caste movement. It would be difficult to cover each and every aspect of the history of Babasaheb Ambedkar's newspapers, but my presentation therefore would briefly introduce the significance of these newspapers to the history of Ambedkarite movement. So before I jump into the main content, we also need to understand the implications of a few things, such as newspapers, journalism, and colonialism. So newspapers, generally, we take it for granted that newspapers, in fact, were there in the colonial period, and they still exist now, and therefore we just take it for granted that newspapers had a role, but it was not that significant. But newspapers, in fact, as I've said in my opening remark, that newspapers played a very crucial role in shaping anti-caste discourse in India. Newspapers have been a recent entrant in Indian social and political life. In fact, if we trace the trajectory of newspapers in India, in fact, we'll have to go back to 19th century, and it was from 19th century onwards things began, or newspapers, in fact, commenced its publications. So we tend to overlook the important contributions these newspapers have made to modern history. It was only in the early 19th century newspapers commenced its public journey in India. It began to play active social and political role in Indian public life. Newspapers have a very important role, as I've been reiterating this point, in shaping the voices of mass movements and thereby creating unique and dynamic public sphere. Therefore, newspapers are too significant to be ignored in the historical studies on Ambedkarite movement. So far as anti-caste movement is concerned, newspapers played very significant role in the development of anti-caste voices in modern period. Be it Satyashodak and non-Brahmin movements in Western India, Dravidian Buddhist movements or anti-Brahmin movements in Tamil Nadu, Adi Hindu or Adi Dharma movements in North India, the role played by newspapers have been tremendous. Simultaneously, we also need to understand the setting in which these newspapers were operating. It was colonial period, after all. Colonialism was an important backdrop in which these newspapers were operating. So socio-political situation was indeed different from the situation after the promulgation of Indian Constitution in 1920. So we are talking about a period that was, in fact, that was dominated by a very different kind of a social political ideas or social political ethos. So we also need to understand that the newspapers that we are referring to today are newspapers that are generally different in terms of age, in terms of time that we live in. So the first important point that we need to emphasize here is that Ambedkarite newspapers were not simply platforms that reported contemporary happenings in the vicinity. Like generally, when we talk about newspapers, when we think about newspapers are generally mediums to report things that are happening in the vicinity or had happening in our surrounding. But newspapers, Ambedkarite newspapers or anti-caste newspapers were more than that. They were not just platforms of reporting things. They, in fact, were also voices that negotiated with contemporary social, political, and religious life in colonial period. Ramifications of these voices were reflected in the political activism and discourses of different organizations that led to crystallization of ideas such as alternative political culture, ideas on Buddhism, ideas on Buddhist conversion, Dalit selfhood, etc., etc. So, this point needs to be understood that we are talking about a newspaper which is not just a medium of news. It was all. Hello.
Yes, Prabodhan, go on.
Yeah. So yeah. So so that's the first point that I want to make here. Let us jump to the main content of the newspapers that we are referring to. That is Ambedkarite newspapers, the newspapers that were established by Babasaheb Ambedkar from 1920 to 1956. Babasaheb, in fact, began his political life in 1920. In fact, it all started in 1919, but in fact, if one wants to, one wants to just, yeah. So if one wants to understand his political positions, we also need to, we need to there's some problem. Hello.
No, it's fine now. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. There's some electricity problem. Yes. Okay. So no, the point that I want to make here is that Ambedkar, in fact, commenced his public life in 1920. Though, in fact, he submitted or he deposited an evidence to Southborough Commission in 1919, and in fact, one can in fact trace his political life to 1919. And from then onwards, one can in fact argue that it was from 1919 he began his public life. But generally speaking, his active political position or his active political life started in 1920. One of the major acts that he did in 1920 was to establish a newspaper that was called Mook Nayak. Mook Nayak, in fact, is a newspaper that was funded initially by Shahu Maharaj of Kolhapur, and this was a newspaper that, in fact, this is the 100th year of the newspaper, this newspaper, in fact, has been one of the most important players in the organized Dalit politics. Ambedkar's newspapers, in fact, continued incessantly for more than 25 years, with a brief interlude in between. Interestingly, barring Mook Nayak and Bahishkrut Bharat, Babasaheb Ambedkar was not actively involved as editor of newspapers. In fact, it was only Bahishkrut Bharat that Ambedkar was actually involved as the editor of a newspaper. Although he distanced himself from everyday functioning of the newspaper, he had a very close eye over the functioning of these newspapers. So, even Mook Nayak was edited by officially speaking, Ambedkar was not the editor of Mook Nayak. We'll come to that point in a minute. But what I want to point out here is that we also need to understand how, in fact, Ambedkar operated from 1920 to 1956 with regard to newspapers. In fact, as I have pointed out in my opening remark, that there has been a neglect with regard to Ambedkar's position or Ambedkar's newspapers, and Ambedkar since 1920 has been emphasizing that in order to establish a firm alternative voice, we need to have independent newspapers that are not associated with the establishment, that are not associated with the established voices, mainstream voices. We need to, in fact, nurture the voices. So, so that needs to be, in fact, highlighted. So, Mook Nayak was the first such, in fact, first such experiment that Ambedkar conducted. And although it was not really very successful, but it was, in fact, as I said, it was the beginning of a new era within anti-caste politics. So Mook Nayak was the first newspaper that Ambedkar established in 1920. Although he was never the official editor of this newspaper, he was actively involved in the every aspect of its production. He single-handedly managed the newspapers for at least first few months. He had to leave India to complete his doctoral studies in July 1920, and therefore he had to hand over the charge of editing newspaper to one Nyandev Dhrunath Ghulam. But what I want to point out here is that Ambedkar, in fact, consciously decided to not name himself as the official editor of Mook Nayak. And in fact, there was a technical reason for that. In fact, Ambedkar was associated, as he was, in fact, part of of a government service. He was in fact employed in a government college, and that in fact forced him to not include his name in the editorial team of Muk Naik. But so far as the writings in Muk Naik were concerned, especially the first year's writings of Muk Naik were concerned, in fact, Ambedkar was, as I said, single-handedly managed the writings of Muk Naik. In fact, he was the one who wrote the columns, he wrote the editorials, and he was actively involved in its production. So, so that is something that needs to be pointed out. And it was only in the July 1920 when, in fact, he went to London to complete his DSc. He had to hand over the job to another person. D.D. Gholap, in fact, became the editor of Muk Naik, and Gholap's, in fact, editorship drew attention of the government on various issues pertaining to a caste question, pertaining to religion, nationalism, and he has the memorable distinction. I'm talking about D.D. Gholap. He has the memorable distinction of becoming the first member of untouchable community to have attained, who was nominated as a member of Legislative Council. So Muk Naik was a newspaper which was established before the establishment of organized Dalit politics. In fact, if you look at the timing of Muk Naik, in fact, Muk Naik was published in 1920, and so far as mass mobilization within Dalit politics was concerned, in fact, it started in 1927 with Mahad Satyagraha. In fact, it was in 1927, one can say, that organized politics, organizational politics, in fact, began within Dalit community. So Muk Naik, in fact, played, despite all these things, Muk Naik played a very crucial role in changing the face of anti-caste politics in India. Muk Naik's establishment in 1920 reflected the conspicuous shift in the social political discourse on caste and untouchability in India. Ambedkar's newspapers, beginning with Muk Naik, helped to inaugurate new politics of assertion that challenged the dominant social diseases. Many people were directly, indirectly involved in the publication of Muk Naik. For example, we have people like Naval Bhatena, a Parsi classmate of Ambedkar, who bailed out Muk Naik several times during its financial crisis. He was also one who pursued industrialists like Godrej to advertise in Muk Naik. Simultaneously, there were other figures such as Sitaram Shivtarkar, a Chambar activist, who in fact also played, at least in the first few years from 1920 to 1936-37, played a very crucial role as Ambedkar's confidant in the movement that Ambedkar led. And we also see several other people involved in Muk Naik, who in fact, these examples highlight how Ambedkar's discourse transcended boundaries of caste and religion. It was in the pages of Muk Naik, Ambedkar famously compared Indian society with the metaphor of dysfunctional multi-storied tower. Each story had, according to Ambedkar, had no stairway to connect with each other, subtly manifesting the absence of healthy social life. Here, the tower represented caste-stricken society, suffocated society, and each story in the tower constituted an individual caste. Again, it was in the pages of Muk Naik, Ambedkar articulated for the first time his critique of Indian nationalism. He argued that Indian nationalism arrogantly invisibilized the caste question. Muk Naik argued that political consciousness disseminated by Indian nationalism was limited only to fight external forces like colonialism, imperialism, or any foreign power. Nationalism as a political ideology, therefore, would have very limited significance to the marginalized communities, according to Ambedkar. Ambedkar had argued elsewhere that although Hindu society was bound together under
The screen is frozen, Prabodhan.
Not just because it was the first newspaper that was started by Ambedkar, but also at the same time, what is important is that it was in Muknaik, we see critiques, we see for the first time critiques of nationalism, critiques of, critique of caste society. And there were, several concerns that Ambedkar, in fact, articulated in this newspaper. Muknaik was closed in 1923. In fact, but there was a financial crisis that, in fact, forced Ambedkar and others to close the publication of to stop the publication of Muknaik. There was a brief interlude in between from 1923 to 1927. Ambedkar had to bear financial loss and many controversies during the publication of Muknaik. In fact, the editor of Muknaik, D.D. Gholab, in fact, later hijacked the publication, and he, in fact, he publicly criticized Ambedkar, and then Ambedkar had to distance himself from the publications of Muknaik from 1923 onwards. So it was till 1923 Muknaik, in fact, was functional. Muknaik was then stopped, and there was, as I said, there was a brief interlude in between from 1923 to 1927. But the Muknaik, in fact, taught Ambedkar how to be attentive with newspapers, how to be alert with his forthcoming newspapers or with his future newspapers. Bahishkrut Bharat was the next publication that he published from 1927, and from 1927 onwards, though, as I've said, that Ambedkar became the official editor of Bahishkrut Bharat. In the later period, in fact, he was not actively involved as the editor, but yet he was, in fact, he had a very close eye on the operation of his newspapers. So Muknaik, in fact, played a very crucial role in making him aware of the challenges that any newspaper can face. So Bahishkrut Bharat is the second newspaper that was established, as I've said, in 1927. It is different from the ambience, the politics of the newspaper was different from Muknaik. Bahishkrut Bharat, as I said, it was published on 3rd April 1927 in the midst of Mahad Satyagraha. The name of the newspaper, Bahishkrut Bharat, was decided in a public meeting held in March 1927. In that way, Bahishkrut Bharat was a newspaper that was a newspaper of a mass movement. Unlike his other newspapers, Bahishkrut Bharat has a memorable distinction of having Babasaheb Ambedkar as its editor. Bahishkrut Bharat had a life of 2 years due to financial problems. Again, Bahishkrut Bharat was closed in 1929. But Bahishkrut Bharat, I would say, was, as compared to Muknaik, was more powerful a newspaper, as it was, in fact, a newspaper which had immense mass influence, which also played very crucial role in shaping the discourse of late 1920s anti-caste politics, particularly in Western India. Bahishkrut Bharat provides us useful content that shows how Ambedkar mobilized the masses with his argument and his activism, his leadership. This was the burgeoning period of the anti-caste movement under his leadership. His perspectives on structural violence, political representation, and access to public resources are very important to understand the political discourses of Dalits in this period. Bahishkrut Bharat help us to understand the operation of mass mobilization. Bahishkrut Bharat help us to unveil the trajectory of assertive mass politics in Western India. It was in the pages of Bahishkrut Bharat, Ambedkar argued that Hindu society was incapable of realizing basic social norms of intermixture and camaraderie. He argued that this absence of social affinity leads to caste violence, and therefore Dalits should be identified separately from Dalit community. So this was a very strong representation for Dalit political Dalit political representation. This was a strong argument for Dalit political representation. It was in Bhishprut Bharat, Ambedkar appealed Dalits to convert to other religion. In fact, in this case, Ambedkar, in fact, openly appealed many Dalits to convert to Islam rather than confine themselves to the hierarchical and oppressive Hindu social order. Bhishprut Bharat in that way was an interesting newspaper, because in fact, as I've said, that this newspaper in fact inaugurated a new era of mass politics in Western India, and this newspaper also acted as a vehicle of ideas of Ambedkar, and this newspaper also played very crucial role, as I've said, in shaping Dalit politics of 1920s and of late 1920s. The next newspaper is Janta. Janta was founded in 1930. Janta again was founded at a very important backdrop. In fact, it was at the backdrop of first round table conference. Janta was founded. In fact, it was founded in November 1930, and it was when Ambedkar had also had gone to England to participate in round table conference. Janta was founded. Janta, in fact, is a newspaper that was not by Ambedkar. So Janta, in fact, if you look at the life of Janta, Janta was the longest serving newspaper of Ambedkarite movement. It began in 1930, and it in fact continued till 1956, 55-56, and then its name was changed to Prabodhan Bharat. So it was the longest serving mouthpiece of Ambedkar, and we can also see how Ambedkar in fact positions himself in this period as not just as an advocate against caste, but also as a champion of politics of marginalized people. So Janta, as I said, was founded in 1930. It was founded at the backdrop of Round Table Conference. It was first edited by Ambedkar's another very important confidant called Devrao Naik. Devrao Naik is an interesting figure which also helps us to understand how Ambedkar's movement, in fact, understood caste question in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. In fact, Devrao Naik was a Brahmin by caste, and it was under his leadership, Janta, in fact, began its publication. In fact, Devrao Naik was considered as one of very, very trusted confidants of Ambedkar, and it was under his leadership we can see Ambedkar's newspapers, at least in the earlier period, and it was under his editorship Ambedkar's newspapers, in fact, began its journey, and new questions were taken up in these newspapers, or in this newspaper particularly. And 1930s, we also need to understand that these newspapers should not be seen in isolation. These newspapers were also, as I've said, were products of particular time period. In fact, in 1920s, when Bhishprut Bharat was established, Bhishprut Bharat, in fact, was a newspaper that represented the burgeoning voice of Dalits, who in fact asserted their position in the form of Mahar Satyagraha, then Kalaram Temple Satyagraha, and several other temple entry satyagrahas or mass movements inaugurated by Ambedkar. It was in 1930s. Although the politics of the Dalits changed, the discourse that Ambedkar in fact had shaped in the early 1930s, in fact, was very was very was not just confined to the caste question. In fact, it was in 1930 Ambedkar also tried to take up larger questions of caste, class, marginality, and questions pertaining to generally pertaining to democracy, like for instance universal franchise, and so on and so forth. So in 1930, Ambedkar's leadership also was a very in fact, Ambedkar's leadership, in fact, attained a national stature in that period, particularly after Roundtable Conference. This newspaper also, in fact, played a very important role in becoming a vehicle of ideas of new political configuration. It was, in fact, it was through the pages of Janta we get to see how that politics, the new politics, was getting unveiled. For a long time, when we talk about Ambedkar's politics, Babasaheb Ambedkar's politics, we tend to focus on certain things, but there are certain questions that are not taken up, particularly in the studies of Ambedkar. So, for instance, Ambedkar's involvement in the peasant movement in Konkan region, the Khoti movement, has been ignored for a long time, and Ambedkar's leadership, in fact, I would say he was one of the earliest leaders who, in fact, who decided to take up the rural question, and it was in the 1930s. In fact, we don't see any communist leadership, in fact, at that point of time, taking up the rural question, the question of peasants. It was Ambedkar, in particularly in Western India, particularly in Konkan region, taking up this question of Khoti, the Khoti landlordism, and in fact he had decided to actively pursue this question. So it was under the leadership of Ambedkar in 1930, a new kind of a discourse on caste, class begin to emerge, and that's why Janta is important, because Janta also help us to unveil. Janta also help us it help us to disclose the new relationship that Ambedkar was trying to forge. The marginalized communities. So not just Ambedkar was taking up the caste question, but he was also trying to engage with other questions, and these questions were also very important questions. So Roundtable Conference, then Khoti question, then in fact Independent Labour Party was another very important landmark event in the decade of 1930s, and Janta, in fact, also documents the politics of Independent Labour Party that was established by Ambedkar in 1936. Then we also get to know several movements, strikes organized by Babasaheb Ambedkar and by his followers in Western India. So Janta in that way help us to, in fact, untangle, also help us to unveil the other side of the movement, which has been, as I said, that this aspect of Ambedkar's contribution has not been taken up that vigorously as it should be. So Janta in that way is a very important newspaper. It was then in 1940s we have a new political party founded by Ambedkar again, Scheduled Caste Federation, and this Scheduled Caste Federation also, in fact, is something that Ambedkar was, in fact, was experimenting with in the decade of 1940s, and what were the reasons that led Ambedkar to form a new party like Scheduled Caste Federation in 1942. In fact, all these questions can be addressed if one get to read Janta of 1930s and early 1940s. So this newspaper is not just a newspaper, as I've said, is not just reporting the things happening in the vicinity, but it was also a newspaper that tried to provide a voice, that tried to provide an articulation of new ideas, new politics. And that's why, Janta is important. The next newspaper that Ambedkar founded was Prabodhan Bharat. Now, Prabodhan Bharat newspaper because although it was not a new newspaper that Ambedkar founded, in fact, Ambedkar established, but it was the same newspaper that was renamed. Janta was renamed as Prabodhan Bharat in 1956. So Prabodhan Bharat, in fact, also help us to understand. Obviously, the name itself tells us the changing priorities of anti-caste movement in the 1950s. But also at the same time, what is important, I would say, is that obviously there has been a lot of discussion and studies on Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism, but very few have in fact tried to point out how that conversion was being articulated for the public. So yes, Ambedkar in fact had decided to convert to Buddhism, and in fact, and there was obviously there's a philosophy, there's an ideology, or everything is there. But also at the same time, what is important is that how that message was being conveyed to the people, and how people were convinced by these articulations is also very important thing to note. And that's why these newspapers played a very important role. These newspapers, in fact, tell us that obviously on one end, Ambedkar's conversion, his position on conversion was not just articulated, but it was also articulated in a very simple language, as in how it was articulated by arguing that how this conversion would be helpful for common people, and how how it is important for common people for common untouchables to convert to Buddhism and to renounce Hinduism. So all these things in fact can be addressed if one wants to study the way conversion happened in 1956. We need to go back to the newspapers started by Ambedkar, and Prabodhan Bharat, in fact, is one such newspaper that, in fact, help us to understand not just Ambedkar's position on conversion, but also Ambedkar's position on religion generally. So that's something that we need to focus on. So the next point that I want to point out is that why do we need to study Ambedkar's newspapers? As I have just introduced you to 4 newspapers, although there are 5 newspapers that Ambedkar established. The other newspaper that I deliberately did not mention was Samta, which was started in the late 1920s. But in fact, we don't have enough copies of Samta, and therefore, it would be difficult for us to say anything about that newspaper. Yes, there are some 2-3 issues of Samta that are available, but otherwise we don't have lots of issues of that newspaper. Nevertheless, these 4 newspapers, in fact, are they established a new kind of a alternative political discourse for anti-caste movement. And so why do we need to study Ambedkar's newspapers? That is something that we need to understand, because most of the time what happens is that Ambedkar's ideas, there is in fact too much of focus on Ambedkar's writings and articulations. Apart from him, we don't get to hear or study the articulations of people associated with Ambedkarite movement. For example, we tend to ignore interesting people like Naval Bhatena, for instance, or Anant Vinayak Chitre for their contribution to the anti-caste movement of the early 20th century under Ambedkar's leadership. We in fact, most of the time we focus when we think about anti-caste politics. Ambedkar certainly is a pillar that in fact played very momentous role in the making of anti-caste discourse. But also at the same time, there is, as I said, there is a conspicuous silence on many people who in fact also played a very important role. Secondly, newspapers help us to untangle the complex picture of how Ambedkar's leadership operated in the then situation. We have, as I said, that we tend to focus on philosophy, we tend to focus on ideology, which are obviously very important, but also at the same time, in order to understand the nuances, in order to understand the operation of movement on an everyday basis, we also need to understand how movement in fact focused on certain issues. So we in fact ignore the operation of movement. We don't have enough writings, studies on the day-to-day activities of Ambedkarite movement of say 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. Obviously, we have memoirs, but we don't have enough studies on these on the activities of Ambedkarite movement. So therefore, newspapers play a very important role. They are in fact the repositories or source of knowledge, a source of how things happened in this period, and how in fact how Dalits in fact position themselves vis-a-vis other voices. So, say for instance, there are many examples. What was Ambedkar's, or what was the position of Ambedkarite politics towards the land question, towards employment, towards, say for instance, housing question. These questions are generally, missed when we just tend to focus only on certain aspect of Ambedkar's writings. In fact, Ambedkar, even in Vaishkrut Bharat, in Mook Nayak, or in Janta, we get to see many writings on these questions, and these questions were also very important questions. So, so that's why newspapers are very important. When the movement and Ambedkar's leadership is discussed, only certain questions are invoked. For example, conversion to Buddhism, constitution making, political representation. But beyond that, we don't get to understand the articulation of the movement. For example, class question, which has been dominant question in the academic discourse, has been missed generally in the later writings. How did Babasaheb Ambedkar understand caste and class question together? Was it reflected in his movement? How did the movement, in fact, how did movement understand the class question? What was its position on class question, class politics? So that these things have been completely missed, and Janta is one such newspaper that is very important newspaper. Unfortunately, we don't have enough. We don't have the publication of these newspapers. This newspaper, it's not in the public domain. There are some 2 issues of yearly issues of Janta that are available, but most of these issues are still in the library, and they are still not in the public. They are still not published. They can be available if one wants to go and study. They are available in Bombay University Library, but otherwise they are not they are not published. So so we don't have enough understanding of the activities. Say for instance, how did the poor amongst Dalit in fact understand the caste question? What was its, how these newspapers understand and conveyed their position on these questions are also very important, and they have not been studied. Then secondly, we have many other questions which were very important questions, particularly in Western India, like the linguistic question that has also been missed. And it was in the newspapers we get to see some very interesting details of how this question was pursued by Ambedkar and his colleagues in the early 20th century. Then, there are certain questions like evolution of Ambedkar's position on political representation. So we, in fact, as I've said, that we just tend to focus on certain aspect of Ambedkar's position on political representation. They say, for instance, the Pune Pact is generally emphasized, but generally we, as I've said, that we tend to miss Ambedkar's position, how Ambedkar evolved his position on political representation. How did he come to that conclusion? That in fact led him to, to that very momentous conflict with Gandhi. So that has also been missed, and newspapers can in fact help us to unveil the subtleties that are involved, that were involved in the position on political representation. Then again, evolution of Ambedkar's position on Buddhism. Now there is a certain trajectory that is being, or a certain narrative that is being viewed in with regard to Ambedkar's position on Buddhism. We have, generally, there is a narrative like Ambedkar, when he passed his matriculation exam, he was presented a book by Krishnaji Arjun Rao Keluskar, a historian and a writer, and then, from then onwards, Ambedkar started getting influenced by by Buddhism. That obviously that could be one way of understanding his position towards Buddhism. But also, there are some interesting things that Ambedkar, in fact, articulated in 1920s and 1930s with regard to religious conversion. In fact, as I've said in my just a few minutes back, that in 1920s, Ambedkar was of this position that Dalits, if they want to convert to some religion, they should convert to Islam, and they should, in fact, if they want to renounce Hinduism, they should rather convert to Islam. So there is a certain position that Ambedkar had taken in 1920s. In 1930s, again, his position vis-a-vis Sikhism is very prominent, and it's there. Many scholars have studied Ambedkar's position on Sikhism, or they have at least referred to that. But what is important is that how Buddhism, for instance, was projected in these newspapers. How, particularly from 1940s onwards, when Ambedkar also became very close to Buddhism, and then there were certain subtle changes that Ambedkar made in the narrative vis-a-vis Buddhism from 1940s onwards. In 1940, in fact, he did not write prolifically in Janta, but in 1940, in fact, he wrote an article on Buddhism, and his article on Buddhism, I think it was published in 1942, 43 in Janta. This article, if one compares this article with Ambedkar's Buddha and his Dhamma, the position taken by Ambedkar vis-a-vis Buddha and his Dhamma, or vis-a-vis Buddhism, is different. Ambedkar here, in fact, argues that yes, we need Buddha, and we need to understand Buddha more closely. But also at the same time, the way Ambedkar portrays Buddha in 1956, that Buddha, I would say, is a very different kind of a Buddha, and that Buddha, in fact, also that portrayal is also that portrayal also has a certain and that's why, the way Ambedkar invokes, say for instance, when he's invoking Buddha, he continuously, as a democrat, Buddha is generally invoked as someone who was was more concerned for equality between males and females, between sexes. He was very concerned for a certain life that would promise equality, that would promise equal distribution of resources. So far as that particular narrative is concerned, in 1942, Ambedkar did not have Ambedkar's position on Buddhism was not, I would say, was a bit different. In fact, he did not. Or yes, one cannot actually conclude. One cannot, in fact, make the sweeping conclusions that Ambedkar did not think about it. But I would say that when Ambedkar in 1950s, when he was thinking about Buddha, he was also not just thinking about Buddha in isolation. He was thinking about Buddha vis-a-vis the things that were happening in the background. So that I think that also shaped his ideas on Buddhism. And that's why the newspapers, particularly the newspapers, for instance, Prabodhan Bharat. In fact, the way Prabodhan Bharat projects the ideas on Buddhism, for instance, in fact, they are, they are very different, politically speaking. They have a very different. They have a certain political position on it. So the point is that these questions, in fact, are can be, if one wants to understand Ambedkarite politics of early 20th century, we need to, in fact, go through the newspapers, and these newspapers, in fact, have been a very important source of information, and they also have been source of voice that was articulated and in that period. So that's why that's the concluding remark that I would say is that we need to, in fact, it's a need to go back and study journalistic writings of Ambedkarite movement from 1920 to 1956, because they help us to situate Ambedkarite voice in a, and we just tend to focus only on, say, philosophy or on ideology. We also need to focus on how these things were happening, how these things, in fact, were being foregrounded in the political domain, and how, in fact, people were reflecting on these questions. I think for that we need to consult the journalistic writings, consult newspapers started by Ambedkar. So that's my take. If you have any questions, we are.
Yeah. Thank you, Prabodhan, for the journey from 1920 onwards till 1956, from Muknayak to Prabodhan Bharat. There are few questions which coming from audience as well as from your presentation. You said that first two newspapers were faced financial difficulties in sustaining. Did those newspapers carry appeal to the mass for support? And as you know, even today, seeking permission to start newspaper is very difficult. It's a very tedious process. You have to take permissions from local administration to up to Delhi. So did newspapers started by Babasaheb face any difficulty from the administration apart from financial problems for first two newspapers?
Now, so far as the first newspaper is concerned, I would say that this newspaper, Muknayak, I'm talking about Muknayak. Muknayak, in fact, was established in a period when organized political activism was actually absent. It was from 1927 onwards we get to see a very assertive kind of assertive kind of political activism taking place. So yes, from 1927 onwards, from Bahishkrut Bharat onwards, we get to see Ambedkar making appeals to the people, to the masses, to help the paper which was in a financial crisis. And let me tell you that in fact at the time of Mahad Satyagraha, in fact there was also a Bahishkrut Bharat Fund by Bahishkrut Hitkarni Sabha in 1927, and they were quite successful in fact in collecting the funds, requisite funds for sustenance, and in that way, in fact, Bahishkrut Bharat, I would say, was in fact was very successful as compared to Moknayak. So Bahishkrut Bharat, in fact, one can say that it sustained primarily because it was funded by the people. And Ambedkar also, Babasaheb Ambedkar also, in fact, made continuous appeals to the people, and I think it was certainly successful. But obviously, you know, if one looks at the resources at that point of time, that the subaltern people, untouchables, Dalits were having at that point of time, it was obviously very difficult for any newspaper coming from that community to sustain. Yet, you know, it was in fact it was able to succeed. It was able to sustain for 2 years. Yeah.
Secondly, Babasaheb never declared any of his newspaper as a mouthpiece of his organizations, may it be Samta Sainik Dal or any other organizations. Only after renaming Janta to Prabuddha Bharat, later only it was as a mouthpiece of Scheduled Caste Federation, right? So how this newspaper galvanized people, how it bring people from, do you think in your research, do you come to those sections where people have conducted mass readings of this newspaper, or subscription has been flown more to more numbers after such mass readings, and it has contributed many people to join the movement and so on?
Yes, in fact, one can get to read, and also there are many testimonies of such mass readings taking place. In fact, you know, one can get the evidence from Bahishkrut Bharat. As I've said, that it was from Bahishkrut Bharat actually, you know, the organized political activism began. So Moknayak, in fact, was different. So far as Moknayak was concerned, we don't have enough evidence. Janta were concerned. These newspapers, in fact, there are instances where people used to read, and they have in fact written in their memoirs, or you know, we have some newspaper reports where it was reported that readings used to happen, and there was obviously such things. So which also tells us, which also help us to understand how in fact the Ambedkarite movement influenced the people. It was not just a movement that was just, you know, talking about equality, liberty, fraternity in abstract concepts. So it was also a movement that tried to, you know, also try to foreground these questions in realistic manners, and that's why Bahishkrut Bharat or Janta or Prabuddha Bharat, in fact, help us to understand how these, you know, these philosophical concepts were realized in actual politics. So in that way, you get to see readings. You also get to see, say, for instance, you know, when Ambedkar converted to, Ambedkar, when he decided to renounce Hinduism in 1935, that famous declaration at Yeola. After that, you know, there were conspicuous changes in the political social culture of Dalit community, and you know, there were many reports in Janta, particularly in 1936-37, where it was continuously said that we need to give up, say for instance, rituals like Satyanarayan Puja, or you know, Ganpati Puja, or so on and so forth. So obviously, you know, we also get to see how things were, how that political articulation was getting reflected amongst the people, and that's why I think it's a very important to understand the newspapers from this point of view. And also, I think I've missed your other question. You said something about mouthpiece and why Bhishmat Bharat was not, in fact, considered as a mouthpiece. In fact, Bhishmat Bharat was, in a way, a mouthpiece of Bhishmat Sabha. But at that point of time, in 1920s, Ambedkar did not have any political party. It was only from 1930 onwards he established a political party, and then, in fact, Janta became its mouthpiece. So that's why we don't find Vaishnav Bharat being considered as a mouthpiece of political organization. But yes, it was a mouthpiece of Vaishnav Hitkarni Sabha, which was again a social organization. Yes.
While browsing, while your research, you did mention that one has to visit some Bombay universities to see those archives and all. But so far there is not in the public domain that most of the newspaper are being republished or something like that. In your research, have you come across any place where you can see the complete archives of all those 4 or 5 newspapers? It will be very helpful.
In fact, in fact, there are some people, like, for instance, we all know Pradeep Gaikwad, for instance, has been publishing a Janta newspaper for last 10 years, and he has, in fact, published 3 yearly issues of Janta. There are some people, but in fact, I can't. I don't know whether they have all the issues. But yes, we know people who have certain collection, but I'm not sure whether they have the collection of Janta from 1930 to 1956, because I think it's too much. And yes, obviously, we would have some people who would be having substantial collection, but I'm not sure whether we have the entire collection. And so far as my Vaishnav Bharat and Moknaik is concerned, I think what is important is that it needs to be translated in English. Someone should, in fact, take the initiative, and it needs to be translated, because there are certain things that, in fact, Vaishnav Bharat, for instance, help us to understand. For instance, the idea of nationalism, how Ambedkar articulates his position vis-a-vis nationalism, his position vis-a-vis, the communal question, Hindu-Muslim question. All these things, in fact, can be understood. Although, translating Janta into English is obviously the most welcome task. But as of now, at least realistically speaking, we should start with translating Moknaik and Vaishnav Bharat. I think if we start with that, I think obviously at some point of time we will be able to translate Janta as well.
Even if we see today in newsrooms, there is no presence of Dalits or Adivasis, right? Any so-called mainstream media and so on. How the newspaper at that period of time, like Dinbandhu or Navakar, reacted to all those newspapers started by Babasaheb? What's your finding on that?
Dinbandhu, but why did you mention Navakar or Kal? What you said, Navakal or Kal?
Navakar.
Okay. No, Dinbandhu, in fact, I suppose you are asking this question that what was the take of other newspapers, say the mainstream newspapers towards Ambedkar. So obviously, there has been, like, if say for instance, many newspapers, in fact, in the 1920s and 1930s were, in fact, obviously they had a certain position on Ambedkar, so they were very obviously critical about Ambedkar. But interestingly, we have also seen, like, if we get to read Sangdev Khairmode's biography on Ambedkar, he had in fact mentioned how some newspapers, particularly in the 1920s, were in fact very they very secretive of Ambedkar's editorial skills, and in fact there were some newspapers who in fact openly wrote how Ambedkar had in fact had a good command not only over language but on the issues. So that's one part. Second part is that so far as the prejudice is concerned, yes, prejudice was always very dominant. Like most of these newspapers, like we all know this story has been in the public domain. For instance, how Tilak's newspaper, in fact, perceived, or Tilak's newspaper Kesari, how it perceived or how it treated Ambedkar's newspaper, Mugnayak. It was generally a courtesy during those days to publish the advertisement of forthcoming newspapers. So it was like just a courtesy to write to the newspaper, the fellow newspaper, and ask them, request them to publish the advertisement that the newspaper that they are publishing is going to be is going to commence its publication very soon. Tilak, in fact, was very he was very in fact he made sure that the advertisement of Ambedkar was not published. In fact, Ambedkar had also offered him a fee to publish the advertisement, yet it was rejected. This was a story that was published in one of the special issues of Janta, and then it became a very popular story. And that also help us to understand what was the take of the dominant newspapers. We have, many nationalist newspapers who are deliberately ignoring not just Ambedkar's leadership, but generally the newspapers, the resources created by the Dalit community. So we have certainly, there was a prejudice, and that prejudice, unfortunately, is still there. And that's why, so far as the newsroom is concerned, we still see very few people coming from scheduled caste, scheduled tribes community being part of the newsroom. So I think, it was very much there in the 19th century. Things hasn't changed yet. We are in the 21st century, and still, things haven't changed. In fact, the famous quote that Vishnu Shastri Chiplunkar made about Phule, when Phule wrote a text, and Chiplunkar in fact argued that Phule should rather first learn grammatical skills, then then write these books. So that was that was very condescending take that one can see. So that condescending take hasn't changed, and that's the most unfortunate part.
Yeah, I mean, yes, though Babasaheb is being appropriated today, in his own words, he was a very hated personality in that period of time. And because of that, prejudices, many dominant newspapers might have not given consideration to his own appeal. But what about the issues he raised? Like you talk about nationalism, you mentioned the issue of Maharvatan Bill, or the issue of Khoti system. How these issues were carried by other newspaper at that period of time? I mean, Khoti was not very much related to as such untouchable issue.
Yeah. So Khoti, in fact, the Khoti question, or the landlords, the Khoti landlords, are dominant in Konkan region. They were dominant at that point of time in Konkan region. And Tilak and most of the Congress leadership of Western India came from that region. So obviously, they were very supportive of the Khoti landlords. So far as the Khoti question is concerned, the people who fought, for instance, in 1936 elections, for instance, we get to see that it was here in Konkan region, Ambedkar's party Independent Labour Party, in fact, received immense success. So as compared to the other regions of India, in Konkan region, Ambedkar was able to win almost all the seats in Konkan region. So this was primarily because the people who supported the Khoti landlords were not just the upper caste landlords, but they were also associated with certain political parties. So there were obviously many political leaders like Tilak, for instance, till 1920. He was very vocal supporter of Khoti landlords. There were many other supporters who, in fact, also sometimes they also identified themselves with very, very successful in doing that. So Maharvatan still, Maharvatan, I would say, it was, if one wants to understand Ambedkar's leadership, rise of Ambedkar's leadership in the early 1920s, we need to, in fact, look at the way Ambedkar argued and mobilized on the question of Maharvatan, because initially in 1927, 28, many members of untouchable community, Dalit community, Mahars, in fact, they argued that someone who had come from abroad, who had this PhD from abroad, how would he understand the predicament of community? And you don't want to accept his leadership. It was Maharvatan, in fact, that it was that Maharvatan movement that, in fact, consolidated Babasaheb Ambedkar's leadership. And if one wants to actually understand the rise of Ambedkar's leadership, Maharvatan is very important example. So, but Maharvatan, in fact, again, is a question which is confined to a certain caste question, to a certain caste. But there were certain questions that questions were not taken up by nationalists and even by communists then. So it was Ambedkar in 1930s, in fact, taking these questions and also, in fact, and he was quite successful in doing that. So that's something that I think is very interesting part about Ambedkar.
Yeah. There are lot of questions around it, Prabodhan, but we have, for the time constraint, we might not take all the questions. But I do have some experience in running a sort of magazine, and it's very difficult to run a magazine on the basis of subscription. And if you see some of the newspaper, there used to be a special issues on Jayanti and so on. So how these special issues contributed financially and from the point of view of subscription started by Babasaheb.
No, I didn't get the question. Special issues.
How the special issues of Janta on the occasion of Jayanti or on some other occasions like Buddha Jayanti, how it contributed from the point of view of generating the finances and also from the point of view of subscription and sort of galvanizing people or mobilizing people.
I think so far as special issues were concerned, like the special issue of Jayanti or Buddha Jayanti in 1930s, or the another special issue that we all know that was published in 1956-57. That, in fact, all these special issues, I think, obviously there were, so far as finances, I'm not in a position to say anything very concrete here, because I'm not really very aware of the finances. This is a question that I haven't thought about it, but I think, so far as the finances of special issues were concerned, I think they were not treated as special issues. They were treated like other issues, but yes, published as special issue. So I think so far as finances was concerned, it did not, in fact, affect in that way. I'm not very sure whether any financial contribution was asked from the people for the publication of these special issues. But I would certainly think that yes, there must have been some arrangement at that point of time in 1930s and 1940s. But also, in fact, I also forget to mention one thing, about Ambedkar's journalism is that, in fact, it was in the special issue that was published in 1930, early 1930s, where you also get to see a new board, editorial board that was established in Janta by Janta, by Ambedkar. And in that, interestingly, there were two women, Savitribai Borade and Ambubai Gaikwad, who were also included in the editorial board. So, which is again, which also help us to understand the broader perspective Ambedkar had vis-a-vis the questions of marginalized. So it was not just as we always tend to understand Ambedkar in a certain way, but I think newspapers, that's why is very important, because newspapers help us to understand the other side of Ambedkar, which generally is unknown to the people.
Thanks, Prabodhan. Before we conclude, any concluding remarks you want to make? And particularly, if you see the newspapers, this fortnightly, in the masthead, there used to be quote from Tukaram, right? What significance you see from that point of view? And you are concluding remarks.
What? Sorry?
What significance do you see?
No, I think, in concluding remark, I would say that things haven't changed so far. Obviously, on one hand, we can see that the caste question, which was taken up by Babasaheb Ambedkar, in fact, had received certain power. In fact, it has become a very significant question that is not just related to the untouchable communities, Dalits and scheduled tribes, scheduled caste, but it has become a question pertaining to democracy, pertaining to functioning of democracy. So, in fact, I would say that in that regard, things have changed. But so far as if one wants to, understand the trajectory vis-a-vis its participation of Dalits in, say, for instance, media, not just media, but in different parts, different walks of life, academia, then bureaucracy, we don't find any, we still have not achieved, or we still not have, we have not attained that kind of equality at that, and I think, the Ambedkar, in fact, is very important at this point of time, because in fact he is the one who is in that way a guiding light, and he is the one who in fact can help us to inspire us, and so far as Tukoba's quotation is concerned, I think what Tukoba has said in that quotation that was referred to by you, I think that is still applicable, that still we need someone who can speak for the voiceless people. And it was Ambedkar then. We are now having Ambedkar's ideas as his legacy. And I think, in order to understand our question, we also need to be bit, we need to broaden our understanding, and not just confine our understanding to one particular question. We need to understand the caste question in a broader perspective, and in a perspective of changed times. So I think I would like to thank you, Priyadarshi, and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Karavan for inviting me, and it was indeed a great experience for me. There was some internet problem here, therefore I had to switch from computer to iPad, and that's why there was some problem with the focus.
No. It was wonderful discussion, beautiful insights, and from this forum, we would like to appeal government of Maharashtra, the publication committee, who basically allocates very little, meager amount for the publication. The condition of the office itself is very pathetic. During VPC time, Dr. Ambedkar Foundation was initiated, and they do publish some of the publication in Hindi and English. So it's a high time that major writings of Babasaheb, which are archives scattered around at various places, they should bring it together. And there are very other questions, like we may not be able to discuss today, but Babasaheb was also engaged in the process of printing itself, right?
Yeah.
He used to
Yeah.
he used to work
Put
with
the
the
bullshit
machines,
press.
the tools.
Yeah.
So certainly, and the way the entire newspaper is being structured, is sections into politics and social issues, so on. We will keep coming to you, Prabodhan, and take this discussion further. And we do appeal government of Maharashtra to make major allocations into this area, and so that people can see the archives which are scattered, and it should bring all those archives to the museum. Thanks, Prabodhan, for joining us. Jai Bhim.
Thank you.